Deer tested the orchard wire the way you tested a door you weren't sure was locked. Light pressure first, then a little more, then a pause to listen for consequences. Red Hollow Orchard sat in a shallow valley where morning fog liked to collect and linger. In summer, the trees held their fruit like quiet promises, rows of Honeycrisp and Gala, branches trained outward, grass kept short between lanes so pickers could move fast. From the road it looked peaceful, white blossoms in spring, green tunnels in July, red and gold wait by late September. But orchards were never truly peaceful. They were negotiated spaces. Humans planted sweetness in neat lines, and wildlife came to test the rules. Eli Mercer didn't notice the first early drop because one apple on grass didn't mean much. Apples fell sometimes, wind did it, birds did it, a branch that got heavy did it. You learned not to panic at one fallen fruit. He noticed because the apples were falling where they shouldn't. Along the east edge, where the orchard met a strip of brush and a dry creek bed, Eli found a scatter of apples beneath the first 3 trees, more than a handful, still firm, not ripe enough to be dropping on their own. He crouched and picked one up. The skin was tight, the color not fully developed. When he pressed a thumb into it, it resisted. "Too early," he muttered. His daughter, June, trotted up behind him, ponytail swinging. She was 12 and proud of being allowed to help with real orchard work instead of just handing out cider samples in the farm shop. "Wind last night?" she asked, because she'd learned to offer farm explanations the way kids offered guesses in school. Eli looked up at the trees. The branches weren't whipped or broken. Leaves didn't show that ragged look wind left. And the grass between rows wasn't littered farther in, only near the east edge. "Not wind," Eli said. He stood slowly and looked toward the fence line. The orchard wire ran the full perimeter, tensioned high tensile with 2 strands electrified low and mid-height. It wasn't a tall deer fence, not the expensive 8-foot kind. It was a practical discourage and redirect setup, enough to teach deer that the orchard edge wasn't comfortable, especially at night, especially when the wire snapped a little and stung. Most nights it worked, but most wasn't always. Eli walked toward the east fence. June followed, stepping carefully around fallen apples like they were clues. Near the wire, the ground was disturbed, not torn up, just scuffed in a long, shallow smear where hooves had shifted and pressed. The grass lay slightly flattened in a narrow path that ran parallel to the fence, as if something had walked the line repeatedly. Testing. Eli bent and examined the soil. Deer tracks, clean, sharp, and fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled. June leaned in. "Deer?" she asked, voice half excited, half worried. Eli nodded. "At least one," he said. Then he looked at the wire itself. The lower strand sagged slightly at one section between posts. It wasn't snapped. It was just looser than it should be. The tension wasn't uniform. Eli pressed 2 fingers against it gently. It gave a little more than it should have. June watched his hand like she expected sparks. "Is it on?" she asked. Eli pulled out his fence tester from his pocket, a small tool he carried like a habit, and touched it to the hot strand. The tester's light blinked weakly. Eli's jaw tightened. "Not strong enough," he said. June frowned. "Did it break?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "Could be the ground's too dry," he said. "Could be a short somewhere. Could be the battery's low." He didn't say the other possibility out loud. A deer had learned the wire wasn't biting like it used to. He followed the wire a few steps and found the likely cause quickly. A fallen twig, blown in from the brush, had landed across the hot strand and touched the grass below. Not enough to fully ground it, but enough to drain charge and weaken the sting. Eli lifted the twig away and tossed it aside. Then he checked the tester again. The blink improved, brighter now. June let out a small breath. "Fixed?" she asked. "Better," Eli said. But he didn't sound satisfied, because the apples had already dropped. He looked back at the trees. Early drop wasn't just about deer eating apples. Deer weren't strong enough to shake entire trees casually, unless they were pushing through, rubbing antlers, or leaning their weight into branches to reach higher fruit. And if they did that, apples fell. They fell early because the tree got jostled before it was ready to let go. Eli started walking the east row slowly, inspecting trunks and lower limbs. June stayed close, eyes scanning the grass. At the fourth tree, Eli found what he'd been expecting, but hoping not to see. A fresh rub mark on the bark at about chest height. Smooth scraped wood where a deer had pressed or dragged something against it. Not an antler rub exactly. Too wide. More like shoulder and neck pressure, the kind deer used when they leaned into branches or posts. June touched the rubbed bark lightly. "It looks like sanded," she whispered. Eli nodded. "They're pushing in," he said. June glanced toward the brush. "But why wouldn't they just jump?" she asked. "Because kids assume deer always jumped fences like in movies." Eli pointed to the low electrified strand. "Because jumping is risk," he said. "Testing is smarter. If they can duck under or push through a weak spot, they don't spend energy jumping." June's face tightened. "So the deer is smart," she said. Eli didn't disagree. He just kept walking. The more he looked, the clearer the pattern became. The trees closest to the fence had the most early drop. Farther inside, the fruit stayed put. This wasn't random. This was edge pressure. Eli's neighbor, Rosa Kim, pulled in around 9 in her small pickup, dust rising behind her tires. She ran a smaller orchard on the next ridge and swapped labor with Eli during busy weeks. When she saw Eli and June at the fence, she shut off her engine and walked over, sunglasses pushed up on her head. "Don't tell me," she said, already reading the scene. Eli held up an early dropped apple. "They're knocking them down," he said. Rosa took the apple, turned it in her hand, and sighed. "They did it to my Gravensteins last year," she said. "Same thing. Not ripe, but they don't care. They'll eat them green if they're desperate, or they'll just knock them and come back." June frowned. "They come back?" she asked. Rosa nodded. "They learn roots," she said. "If the wire is weak one night, it's a clue. They'll test again the next." Eli glanced at the fence tester still in his hand. "I cleared a short," he said. "But I think they already figured it out." Rosa squinted along the fence line. "You got a sag there," she noted. "Post might be loose." Eli followed her gaze. One of the posts leaned a few degrees inward, subtle but real. Dry soil and repeated pressure could loosen it. A deer didn't have to break the fence to exploit it. It just had to make a gap big enough to nose through or press against. Eli exhaled. "We tighten and brace today," he said. Rosa nodded. "And you pick up drops," she added. "Don't leave them. Dropped apples are an invitation. The smell travels." June looked at the grass full of fruit with a new expression, less free snack and more evidence. Eli handed her a crate. "Start gathering," he said. "We'll feed the goats with these later, but they can't stay here." June nodded and began picking apples, dropping them carefully into the crate. Each thud sounded heavier than it should have for fruit that wasn't ready. Eli and Rosa worked the fence. They drove a new support stake beside the leaning post, tamped soil hard, and tightened the wire with a ratchet tool until it sang with tension when plucked. Eli checked voltage again. Stronger now, crisp blink on the tester. Then Rosa did something Eli hadn't thought of. She sprinkled a line of crushed limestone along the fence base where deer tracks were thickest. "What's that for?" June asked, pausing with the crate half full. Rosa smiled. Tracking, she said. If they come tonight, we'll see fresh prints clearly, and if the ground stays dry, it helps show movement. Eli appreciated that. He didn't want guesses. He wanted proof, timing, route, number of deer. By late afternoon, the east edge looked cleaner. Fallen apples removed, fence tightened, voltage restored, brush trimmed back so fewer twigs could short the wire. From a human perspective, the system was repaired. But Eli knew better than to assume the story ended with a tool and a fix. Animals didn't stop because you fixed something once. They tested again, like a person checking a door after hearing it might be unlocked. At dusk, Eli walked the east edge one more time alone. The orchard was quiet now, the farm shop closed, the air cooling fast. The brush beyond the fence rustled softly in the evening breeze. Somewhere deeper in the valley, a dog barked. He stood still and listened. He could imagine the deer out there, their ears turning, their noses tasting the wind, their memory of last night's easy weakness. He looked down at the grass where the apples had fallen and felt a small, stubborn frustration. The apples had dropped early because the deer didn't need to steal them cleanly. It just needed to take advantage of a moment when the orchard's defenses felt soft. A wire fence wasn't just wire. It was a message. This is not easy. Tonight, Eli hoped the message would be loud enough again. Because if the deer had already learned the edge was negotiable, it would return, not as a reckless intruder, but as a patient tester. And in a place built on timing, early was the one word you never wanted associated with your fruit. The deer came back the same night, because that's what testers did. Eli didn't see it with his own eyes. He saw it in the orchard's morning language, prints, scuffs, and the way the apples told the story in silence. At 6:05 a.m., fog still clung low between the rows, turning the orchard into a soft gray tunnel. Eli walked the east edge with his fence tester in one hand and a thermos in the other. June trailed behind, still sleepy but curious enough to wake fully outside. Rosa had been right about the limestone. Fresh tracks showed up on it like ink. 2 sets, not one. One larger, likely a doe. One smaller, maybe a yearling. The smaller prints tracked right beside the larger, stepping where the older deer stepped, as if following a lesson. Eli's jaw tightened. 2, he said. June leaned closer, eyes wide. They came, she whispered. They tested, Eli corrected, then immediately wished he hadn't sounded so grim. June didn't need fear. She needed understanding. He followed the tracks along the fence line. The deer had paced the perimeter for a while, back and forth, like someone walking a hallway looking for a weak latch. Then the prints clustered at the same sagging section where the post had leaned yesterday. Except now, the post was braced, and the wire was tight. Eli crouched and studied the soil. Fresh scuffs, a hoof scrape where the deer had pushed forward and slipped slightly. Another scuff where it had backed up. Then, this detail mattered. Prints angled away rather than crossing under. They had approached the fence and decided not to go through. Eli lifted his fence tester and checked voltage at that section. Bright, crisp blink. Good. June exhaled. So they didn't get in, she asked, hope lifting her voice. Eli stood and looked toward the trees. Not through the fence, he said. Then he started walking the row anyway, because he'd learned to never stop checking after you saw tracks. Halfway down the first lane, he found a fresh cluster of apples on the grass beneath a low limb. Not as many as before, but enough to make his stomach sink. June saw it and groaned. No, she muttered. Eli crouched and picked one up. The skin was bruised, not bitten. Another apple nearby had a small tooth mark, but wasn't eaten. The rest were simply dropped, knocked off the branch. He looked up at the limb above. Leaves were disturbed, and the branch angle looked slightly lower than it should. Not broken, just bent. The deer hadn't gotten into the orchard through the wire. It had reached through it. Eli walked back to the fence at that exact spot and measured the distance with his eyes. The tree trunk was several feet inside the orchard, but the outer limbs stretched toward the brush line. A deer standing outside could push its head through the fence gap between strands and tug at the branch, pulling fruit within reach. It didn't need to breach the perimeter. It just needed leverage. And leverage made apples fall. Rosa arrived soon after, as if she'd woken up thinking about it too. She stepped out of her truck, saw Eli's face, and didn't bother with greetings. "They reached through," she said. Eli nodded. "They didn't cross," he replied. "They just worked the edge." Rosa walked to the fence and studied the limb. "Classic," she said. "Once they learn they can pull a branch, it's over unless you change the branch." June frowned. "We have to cut it?" she asked, sounding sad, like cutting a limb was hurting the tree. Eli shook his head. "Not cut the whole limb," he said. "But we can prune the reach, raise the skirt." Rosa nodded. "And add a third hot strand," she added. "Higher. Deer can reach between wires. If you add a line at nose height, it discourages that lean-in tug." Eli sighed. He didn't love adding more wire. More wire meant more maintenance, more places to short, more complexity. But he also didn't love feeding deer his crop one early drop at a time. They spent the morning doing two things at once, pruning and redesigning the message. Eli took loppers and trimmed the lowest outer limbs on the trees nearest the east fence, lifting the skirt so there were fewer branches close enough for a deer to grab from outside. He hated doing it because those limbs held fruit, good fruit. But he reminded himself, fruit that fell early was wasted anyway. June helped by gathering the small pruned branches and stacking them neatly, her earlier excitement replaced by a quiet seriousness. Rosa installed a third electrified strand on insulators about 3 feet high, right where a deer's nose and neck would press if it tried to reach in. She kept the line clean and tight, then checked voltage again. When they finished, the fence looked slightly more serious, like it had stopped trying to be polite. By afternoon, the orchard edge felt different, not just physically, psychologically. Eli knew deer didn't think in human words, but they did think in experience. What stung, what didn't, what worked, what wasted energy. He wanted wasted energy to be the lesson. That evening, Eli set the trail camera on a post facing the east edge, angled to capture both the fence line and the low limbs. If the deer came again, he wanted to see exactly how they approached, where their noses went, how long they lingered, whether they brought more company. At 5:12 a.m. the next morning, the camera delivered the proof. A doe appeared first, stepping out of the brush with that careful, quiet confidence deer had at the edge of human spaces. She approached the fence, ears swiveling, nose working. A yearling followed, smaller, staying close. The doe walked directly to the fence section where the sag had been, the spot that had worked once. She lowered her head and sniffed. Then she leaned forward slightly, and the new hot strand cracked softly, tiny audible snap. The doe jerked back instantly, head lifting. Not a dramatic leap, but a quick recoil that said the message had been delivered. She tried again at a different gap, nose probing. Snap again. She stepped sideways, searching for a safe approach. She found none. Then she shifted tactics, moving toward the tree limbs that had been reachable before. But the limbs had been lifted. She stretched her neck, reaching, and met air instead of fruit. She took one step closer and met the new hot strand again. Snap, sting, retreat. The yearling watched all of it, hesitating, then mimicking a tentative reach and recoiling even faster. Eli watched the footage with June and felt something loosen in his chest. Not victory, but a sense that the deer's test had finally gotten an answer clear enough to stick. They didn't linger long. After a minute of probing, the doe turned and walked back into the brush. The yearling followed, glancing once over its shoulder, as if trying to memorize the new boundary. No apples dropped that morning. The grass beneath the east edge trees stayed clean. June looked up at Eli, relief bright in her face. "So we won?" she asked. Eli smiled, but it was tired. "We held it," he said, "for now." Rosa, watching with them, nodded. "That's the goal," she said. "Not winning forever, just making the edge not worth it." Eli walked the orchard later that day, listening to the quiet of Rose that hadn't been shaken overnight. He touched a branch and felt the fruit holding firm, heavy, not ready to let go. That was what he wanted, timing intact. The apples had dropped early because the deer had found a weak message in the wire and a reachable branch that made the orchard feel negotiable. Now the message was sharper, and if the deer returned, as it always might, it would return to a boundary that behaved like it meant what it said.